Aloha, we're back from lunch, ready for a wonderful afternoon of speaking truth to power. Thank you for joining us, and this will continue on until 4:30 with a 10-minute break. This is Pono Power's turn to present our case, our experts and our witnesses. Aloha.
Hi, calling the hearing back to order.
My apologies.
No problem. Dr. Richardson, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please have a seat. We'll begin with the direct examination.
Aloha and good afternoon, Dr. Richardson. Please state your full name for the record.
Brian Richardson.
Please give a brief overview of your qualifications to opine on community outreach.
Okay, I have various degrees from the University of Hawaii and the University of Victoria, including a PhD and master's and bachelor's in political science, as well as a master's degree in education administration, and then also philosophy degrees, including a PhD, where I focused on political philosophy, so the nature of information and so on.
Are you the sponsor for responses to consumer advocates information requests 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18?
Yes.
Are you also the sponsor for responses to Maui Electric supplemental information requests 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14?
Yes.
And are you the sponsor for the responses to Innergex's information requests 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16?
Yes.
Okay. And your written report about the community outreach was submitted and filed with the commission?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Have you reviewed the requirements for the community outreach plan and implementation in the RFP and the PPA?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And can you give us a summary of your understanding of those requirements?
My understanding is the requirements involve effective community engagement without necessarily defining what the community is within the requirements themselves, but part of the obligation is to determine who the communities are and then to engage with them effectively and then adjust the plans as appropriate. And there are different criteria that are used depending on whether it's the RFP or the PPA.
Have you reviewed the community engagement plan and process employed in the instant proceeding?
The community engagement plan?
And process, the outreach plan and process that has been used or has been alleged to be used in this.
I don't think I saw a plan. I saw the 2018 report, right? But there's no initial plan. Is that correct? I mean, unless I've got my titles wrong, and I apologize if I do.
That's right. It's
Okay.
not a plan.
Yeah, no, I've reviewed the 2018 report from December.
Report.
Yes.
And if you could summarize what your findings are with respect to the community outreach report.
Okay, I found that there was some detail of particular activities. I found in terms of evaluating the overall appropriateness of the community outreach that it was inadequate. That there was a lot of information that wasn't available or wasn't made available. and this was part of my report as well, is that there's a lot of things that are not included or not made available to people, and so the overall effectiveness of the community engagement becomes a lot less, in part because people don't have enough information. And I think that the report from 2008, the end of 2018, reflects that, in the sense that there are summaries of we met with this person, met with that person, but no real content in terms of what happened at the meetings, or what people thought about as a result of the meetings.
Is it your opinion that the community outreach and its implementation is sufficient to meet the goals and requirements outlined in the RFP and the PPA?
No, I don't believe they're adequate.
How would a better community outreach process look?
I think there are various aspects of this, and it's really a much broader topic, and really a topic of conversation. One of the things that I think is key would be to have a talk about what the proper process is, because part of the community engagement is to have access to the process itself, and to be able to change the process, to request documents, to request meetings, and so on. And so it's in a way I can't answer that question in any detail, but I think part of it is in order for people to form appropriate opinions and to be able to engage in the process, they need enough information. And I think that's one of the biggest things lacking in this process was that so much of it has been secret. It has been behind veils of sort of secrecy, I suppose. Right? So just repeat the word. And that there's if you don't have that sort of information, then if you're interviewing people and they say they support it or they oppose it, it's really hard to tell why they're supporting it or opposing it. And I think in this particular case, it may be that a lot of people support it in part because they support solar, and solar is a good energy a good way of producing energy. But but that doesn't mean that they understand this particular installation or this particular proposal. And then the other is, and one thing I go into some detail in my report is the value of having an external group sort of handling the community engagement activity, in part because otherwise it just comes across as marketing, right? And that if the company is in charge of the civic engagement or the community engagement, then there are all of these questions of, well, why was this decided, or why can't we get access to that, and so on. And because the company forms, in essence, a black box of decision making, there's really not a lot of ability for people outside of that box to say, oh, that process was fair. And I think that's one of the biggest things with community engagement, is that there ought to be the sense that the process was fair. And it's difficult when the process isn't open. And so transparency would be another that I think would be important, that people see, people not only see that there's a result, but they see why that result came about. And I could go on in some ways, because there are a lot of aspects to this that are important.
Could you discuss the significance or not significance of the website and the tracking tables?
Oh, sure. One of the things that I had been asked by the consumer advocate, I believe, was, what would I do differently, or how would I improve? And one of them was focusing on the website. And to me, that's one of the essential aspects of any public engagement at this point. This is the 21st century, right? And so the idea, I think I've seen some projects where there are no websites, and then it's like that to me would be just a disqualification if you're not making information public. In this case, there was a website that was somewhat buried in the larger corporate website, and then when you start talking about sort of what's the quality of information on that website, I found some of it was quite lacking. One in particular that I talk about is the timeline, and how the timeline, first of all, doesn't seem to be updated very often, and it also is missing a lot of details. And then there's also a lot of corresponding content. So, for instance, one of the recommendations that I had read in some of the documents I was reading was, you should have a video of public events, and that should be on the website so people can refer back to it. Because at this point, if anyone challenged what happened at a public meeting, there's no evidence, right? There's recollection maybe, but as far as I know, there are no minutes to meetings. There's the PowerPoint that has been put up, but otherwise, there's really not a lot of ability to engage or to check or to re-engage with the material. And I think that's a problem, because when you're having these long-term conversations, if you can't refer back to things in any reliable way, then you end up, as I think we've seen, you end up trusting the company to say, yes, this is what happened, or yes, this is what this is why we decided this. And yeah, having an external structure, I think, is very important. And that, again, is one reason why having an external group managing that is important.
And what about the tracking tables?
Well, I mean, I thought cognitively the tracking tables were interesting, right? Because it was a good way of dividing out certain issues as they arose, and then sort of tracking how they changed. The problem with it, I found, as I pointed to here, is the PDF structure just didn't work. Partly because it's a static document, and so you're really not able to track an issue. It's just a single tabular representation of here's an issue, here's the response. And so you don't get to be able to see sort of how it develops over time. You also don't end up then getting to see, like, I think that the table would list who had objections or who had comments, but it wouldn't link back to, for instance, what those comments were or where they came from. So if there was an email where someone talked about it, ideally that should be connected back to like the table itself, or however it's represented, should be connected back to the primary sources. Again, to maintain confidence in the intellectual or the informational integrity of the system.
Thank you. We have no further questions. No further questions. Thank you.
Pursue cross-examination from Maui Electric.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Richardson, you provided your work history and a summary of your experience in a response to a couple of different IRs, correct? Mm-hmm. For the part, you could say yes or no.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, yes.
So I just wanted to confirm, have you ever been professionally retained to prepare a community outreach plan for a project such as the one that we're here talking about today?
No.
Okay. Have you ever been retained or employed by a government agency or any other reviewing agency to determine, evaluate the reasonableness or effectiveness of a community outreach plan such as the one we're talking about here today?
I don't think so. I mean, the only, and this is probably, the answer would be no, but I think I worked at Wimmer Community College where I was the webmaster. And there were instances where we would do outreach activities. And so I was part of, because being part of the website, I would have done content and potentially assessment of that. But that would be the scope.
And I believe your response to one of the IRs was that you've never been qualified by any court, administrative agency, or arbitrator as an expert witness in the subject matter of community outreach plans and their effectiveness, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. On the bottom of page 1 of your report, you state, quote, and I'll let you go ahead and find that.
Good, okay. Page 1?
Yes.
Okay.
You say a poorly organized engagement strategy, on the other hand, can lead to disenchantment because people are not given an opportunity to engage, or when people engage, they do not see any results. So there's obviously kind of two concepts at issue there, I think. I understand the first part is that you're saying that an inadequate plan may not allow an opportunity to learn about the project, ask questions, and provide feedback. Is that kind of what you're talking about in the first part?
Well, I think, yeah, there are many facets of engagement, but certainly those three would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second part, though, I'm interested in as far as the not seeing any results.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about people not seeing any results, do you mean that they don't see any changes in response to any comments submitted by the community, or that they don't see results in the sense that they don't feel like they're getting specifically what they want on a subjective basis?
I think both. I mean, I think even that they don't think they're being listened to. I mean, whether actual changes happen or not, it's whether they're being listened to or not.
And how is there a way to measure how somebody feels whether they're being listened to if they're not getting what they want?
I think that would go back to the question of fairness, right? That it is possible for someone to say, yeah, I lost or whatever, but the process was fair. And so I think that would be one way.
Does the nature of the request that's being made by any one citizen or community group, as far as whether or not it's a reasonable request matter in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of a community outreach plan?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So if a community group were to say, you know, we would like $1 million a piece as part of your community outreach, and then they were disgruntled or unhappy because they didn't get it, you would not characterize that as a failure of the outreach plan, right? I mean, because there's just no way for the outreach plan to satisfy that.
Right, assuming that it is unreasonable, yeah, which I think your example is, yes, it would be.
Okay. So in terms of, yesterday, Chair Griffin asked the consumer advocate to suggest future changes that would address the community concerns. Were you here for that testimony?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not going to quote this word for word, but the gist that I took away from the answer was that essentially that question was better left to the members of the Pono Power initiative who are interveners in this docket. Did you hear that?
To figure out how to engage?
Yes, as far as suggestions that the developer could take on a going forward basis.
In terms of the process itself, or
Yeah.
in terms of the results?
Well, I can't speak for the consumer advocate
Okay.
as to which he interpreted, that was my takeaway on that. I guess my question to you though is, do you agree that it would be up to members of Pono Power to determine what additional community outreach efforts would be needed and whether or not what's been done to date is sufficient?
No, I mean, for several reasons. One is at least not exclusively Pono Power, because they're not and this is part of community engagement. It's a very complicated, often messy process. But I think they are stakeholders, and so they would be part of what would happen. Yeah.
So you would agree with the concept that it's not really a subjective decision by Pono Power as to whether the community outreach has been sufficient, and that the commission shouldn't be just blindly accepting that the mere fact that Pono Power is dissatisfied means that the entirety of the community outreach program was a failure.
Well, yeah, I don't think you should accept anything blindly. I mean,
Okay.
However, it is evidence that there are issues. I mean,
And when you say it's evidence that there are issues, it's evident because of the fact that the Pono Power Coalition members, at least the ones who provided testimony, feel that they did not get heard in the sense that they didn't get the requests that they were seeking as part of the engagement process.
that would be part of it. Yeah.
So in commenting in your report, I think you say something to that effect on page 4 when you say that not all comments or responses will be relevant, well supported, and actionable within the scope of the project. And then later in that paragraph, you state that even if not every stakeholder is satisfied with the interaction, a robust engagement process depends on the interaction taking place. And then further down, the goal is not that everyone is happy with the results. The goal is that everyone is as satisfied as possible with the process.
Mm-hmm.
And that's consistent with your opinion as to how we should evaluate, or how more accurately the commission should evaluate the effectiveness of a community outreach plan.
In a sense, I'm not giving criteria here necessarily, but saying that a certain one particular facet of the criteria shouldn't overwhelm everything. Yeah.
So one person being dissatisfied with the process, you're saying that's not enough as far as a criteria or a standard.
Well, it's not about voting. It's not about how many necessarily. It's the qualitative, do they have reasons, right? I mean, I can be dissatisfied and have no reason to be, or it could be some really stupid reason. But on the other hand, you could have one person who's dissatisfied for very good reasons, and that should, and then the question is how, what mechanism do you have to determine what counts as reasonable and what doesn't? And that's where the need for some sort of external oversight, ideally, or some sort of external, manager of the process becomes important.
You would agree that the commission represents external oversight as to the effectiveness and reasonableness of the process?
Yes and no. I mean, in a sense, because they don't have an ongoing interaction with the process. I mean, they're not deciding where events happen, who gets invited, under what conditions, what happens to the information. I mean, much of the information is certainly private or secret for us. I don't know if you have access to the internal documents of the company. So no, in a sense, I mean, I think they have an oversight in a sort of much larger way. Management. sort of management of the process.
Okay, on page 9 of your report, you summarized comments of PPC, or at least somebody from PPC. And those comments from PPC as Innergex's position. So this is PPC's take on what it feels Innergex's position is, not necessarily Innergex's actual position, right?
Right.
So it says, we will not relocate the industrial power plant to industrial land. That was one of the criteria, or one of the statements made as PPC's perception of what Innergex's position was, right? So is it your position that because Innergex doesn't relocate, let me rephrase that. If the fact that Innergex wouldn't relocate its project to a different site could result in the individual who made that comment feeling like they're not being listened to.
Right, it could, yeah.
So, but as I understand, you're not saying that subjective opinion about whether or not they feel they're being listened to should be the determinative factor for the review process that the commission undertakes. The commission should be looking more at the overall community, the overall changes in responsiveness, the overall process, and not just one small group or one small handful of individuals, correct?
Yeah, they should be looking at more than that, though, because they should be looking at why the change, or why isn't the change happening. Because it could be right, this could be correct that they are unwilling to relocate, even if it's just one person who's unhappy.
Did you listen to the testimony yesterday regarding the changes that were made to the project as a result of the public comments?
Yes, I believe I heard those.
Okay, thank you. In your response to Pa'ahu PPC IR 11, you state that, let me give you a second.
Sorry, yeah,
I'll quote it, but I'll.
Sorry, IR.
PPC IR 11, Pa'ahu PPC IR 11. So this would be an IR from Pa'ahu to Pono Power.
Sorry, as you pointed out, this is my first time doing this. Okay. I allowed to ask help?
You know what? I don't know if we need that.
Okay, that's
When
fine,
I say
yeah.
the thing, my sense is you'll agree
Okay.
with the statement that was made in that.
Sure, okay.
You state, quote, you state that the engagement has been, quote, insufficient to allay any concerns. So, I mean.
Oh, yeah, and actually that one, I feel that I should have said all concerns, or most concerns, because yeah, to say all is, to have a categorical statement there would be inaccurate.
You're agreeing that in fact, you cannot say that there has been no allaying of any concerns.
Right.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that.
Yeah, and I apologize for that. That was one of those, if I could edit later, but clearly there are concerns that remain.
You reviewed the public comments to this project?
I did.
Okay. And were any of them in support of the project?
Yes.
Were any of those by Maui Meadows residents?
That I don't know. I can't remember. I believe, no, actually, that's not true, because I remember finding one, at least. So yes, there was one.
Were there a number of public comments that disagreed with your position that the public outreach process had been insufficient?
I believe I read one or two of those as well. I'm not sure if it's in that document, but yeah.
And in fact, there was discussion earlier today regarding the statement submitted by the chair of the Maui Sierra Club, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And his comment submitted stated that actually there had been a significant amount of community outreach, at least in the opinion of the chair of the Maui Sierra Club.
Especially in comparison to the other project that he had talked about. Yes.
So in terms of your suggestions as to how the commission should be evaluating the reasonableness and effectiveness of the community outreach plan, how should the commission square the opinion of a nationally recognized environmental protection group like the Sierra Club relative to Pono Power Commission, a smaller group of residents in a neighboring area? I mean, how do you sort of weigh those, I guess?
Well, part of it, as was pointed out earlier, is it's not the Sierra Club. I mean, it's an individual who has who is part of the Sierra Club, but my understanding is that it's not an official statement of the Sierra Club.
Did you get confirmation from him that it's not the Sierra Club
No.
of Maui?
No, but I looked at the email and it doesn't say the Sierra Club is doing this. And if you look at, I looked at the Sierra Club website for Maui and it doesn't have any mention of it.
The email at issue is signed on behalf of the chair, and then after that it says Chair Maui Sierra Club, correct?
That I can't remember. I believe it is, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but as you sit here today, you don't know whether or not that was taken on behalf of his role as chair of the Maui Sierra Club or as an individual.
Right, no, actually, though, the email is first person, if I remember correctly.
Right.
So it does not say the Sierra Club believes this, it's I believe this. And
Right.
so,
And then it's signed on behalf of him, and then it says his name, and then Chair Sierra Club.
right. Though typically how emails work is, you get the footer automatically whether you're making that decision or not.
Do you know whether that's an automatic footer or not?
No, it looks like an automatic footer because it's so long, you don't type that out every time.
Okay.
I mean, but my experience is automatic
I just
footers
want to
are,
confirm that's
Yeah.
speculation.
it is, yes,
Okay.
Yeah.
So you haven't spoken with him.
I have not, no.
Okay.
Oh, and getting back to your earlier question, whether whether the Sierra Club should effectively trump the local organization. I mean, I think you have to step back and make a larger assessment about the quality of the participation. And one thing I wonder is how much does the Sierra Club of Maui know about the project? I mean, he has been on site a few times, but for instance, he doesn't have, as far as I know, he doesn't have access to the original proposal. He doesn't, I mean, there are a lot of things that you could say he or the Sierra Club don't know about the project. And so on what basis are they, on what basis would they have a higher standing?
I'm not saying that they would have higher standing. I was asking you, how do you reconcile the two? Do you, I mean, if somebody has enough information to make up their mind, which I'm guessing he must have, although I don't know. I haven't
Well,
spoken.
see, the thing with that is people always have enough information to make up their mind because they can just make up their mind on nothing, right? I mean, this is, so that becomes part of the assessment is do people have access to enough information? And if there's a lot of information that's not available, then, then it's harder. It's not harder for people to make up their mind, but it's harder for them to make up their mind with good cause. And I think that's part of why you want civic engagement is to give people enough information to be able to deliberate properly.
And so I'd like to talk about now scope of your testimony. Are you, you've provided a number of suggestions and things. Is it your testimony that these are goals or improvements that should be implemented in terms of future RFPs, or is it your testimony that there is an actual failure to comply with the terms of the RFP and the terms of the PPA in this particular project?
I think both. A lot of the suggestions, I think, especially in response to the consumer advocate, were much more, here's how it could have been done, or here's how maybe it could be done in the future. At the same time, I think that the way that the process has happened, it doesn't meet really any sort of serious criteria for community engagement.
Have you reviewed the community engagement efforts of any of the other PPAs that have been approved by the commission?
I looked at the one for Central Maui just out of curiosity, in part mainly because of the comment from the Sierra Club. I forget his position, but the person from the Sierra Club. And that to me seemed appalling. And I think part of the issue there is I teach, right, and so there are times when you get a student who gets 20% on an exam and they say, well, I should pass because this other person got 5%. And it's, these things shouldn't be graded on a curve, right? I mean, that's, yeah.
In terms of your review and developing the opinion that you have regarding the effectiveness and reasonableness and compliance with the RFP and PPA terms, have you reviewed any of the prior PPAs that have been approved by this commission and have found that their community outreach efforts were sufficient to comply?
I didn't review any other.
Okay. I don't have any further.
Thank you.
Consumer advocate,
Go across.
Waiapu Solar.
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Professor Richardson, just a few follow-up comments.
Sure.
You spent some time talking about a possible or proposed independent entity that would be in charge of overseeing the community outreach process, is that correct?
Mhm.
And I believe you testified in response, or your response that you sponsored to CAPPC IR 17B confirms that this has not been done anywhere else in Hawaii.
That I'm aware of.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And has that continued to be your position as of today?
Yes, I haven't done any further
Okay.
research on that.
And I assume you're not aware of any such type of oversight entity outside of Hawaii as well, is that correct?
Not in public utilities, no. I mean, it is something that has happened, and I think I mentioned this in my report, in other fields such as in education and so on, where you do have, you do have entities that to mediate between, the school boards and the parent-teacher associations and so on.
So, but here you would agree, I think it's a little different insofar as we're talking about commercial development of the
Right,
project.
and that's why I didn't really talk about those, because they were different enough that it didn't seem like they would offer that much insight.
So you agree those probably don't provide real precedent for the kind of entity you're discussing?
Not precedent, I mean, they could provide interesting ideas, as something like this got worked out.
And just thinking about the mechanics, just to help us understand how
Sure.
how this would work in real life, would that independent entity have the ability to answer substantive questions about the project the same way that the developer would?
No, I mean, my thought on this would be that it's really a logistical entity that handles, that's the one that receives emails, for instance, or the ones that will organize events and maybe mediate between, what documents should be available and shouldn't. And this is one of the big issues, I think, in this particular case is there are certain people have expectations that documents would be available, like the plan, the original plan, and or the original community outreach plan. And the fact that that's not available, I think, has created a fairly negative feeling for people in terms of the quality of the process. And so it gives you someone other than the two, in a sense, the two combatants. And I think this is one thing that's unfortunate with the way a lot of the vocabulary gets used here is that, it does really seem to be Pono Power against Innergex, right? And I think that the structure of the interaction really encourages that, unfortunately, right? Because it is a sort of us versus them, and because there's no oversight, or not oversight, I'm sorry, but there's no person maintaining the conversation or keeping the conversation going. It does mean that there's increased mistrust, right? And I remember a question earlier today, why wasn't a meeting set up? And I forget the specific dates, but a meeting set up between Pono Power and Paiahu, and and it was. I thought the answer was it didn't allay any suspicions. I suspect the way that it was answered. And
so getting back to my original question,
Sure.
though, I believe what I'm hearing is that your sense is that the independent entity, which I'll call it that for now,
sure.
Would really not have the ability to answer substantive
No.
questions in response to genuine concerns raised by the community. They would not have the ability to do that. So,
Well, it accepts questions about the process. I mean, I would see that, but yeah, not in terms of where things go or that. No, I mean that's really a company thing. I mean, I think,
Thank
or
you.
an FPC thing.
thank you. And then would this? I assume you would agree that interposing this type of independent entity in the process would entail some kind of cost that would have to.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. And how would you anticipate that would be funded?
That's really a PUC question, maybe. I mean, I think it's really a question of where you put your funding, in the sense that, I mean, this is obviously costing a fair amount of money as well. And so having a sort of a proactive way of mitigating some of these concerns would be probably a cost savings overall. Who would pay for it? I don't know. I mean, that's a budgeting question in some ways.
But it's pretty clear it would increase costs.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things, or part of the reason for having this sort of external group is that, like the first one will probably be more expensive, right? But as it becomes part of standard operating procedures, then it becomes a lot less expensive. And this is one of the things I noticed, certainly looking at the other PPA, but also just what I've heard of from some of the other started from zero every time, right? And it shouldn't be a surprise, right? I mean, it should be, every large-scale public utilities project should have a website, and the website should have an email account, and it should have documents, and it should have, like there's a certain expectation where, it's like opening a McDonald's. The first one is really expensive. But once you've opened 3 or 4 of them, there's sort of a pattern that would happen, and none of these projects are different enough that it would be costly.
But of course, I think you'd agree that an experienced developer would have completed the community outreach process perhaps multiple times before and be working with consultants that also have experience with the community outreach process. So they wouldn't necessarily be starting from scratch given they have prior experience. Isn't that a fair kind of statement?
Maybe, though it depends on whether they're out of state or not and what the expectations are for particular locations. And honestly, I don't get the sense that public utilities, that those projects often have community engagement. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to claim that one or the other.
With regard to, I apologize, I didn't mean to speak.
No, it's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
And so, given the current posture of this project where we're seeking PPA approval and community outreach, a substantial amount has been completed, you're not suggesting that we consider this kind of independent entity for this particular project. This is just something that you think would be good to do in the future, I assume.
Well, so 2 things, actually. I think I would object to the idea that the outreach is substantially finished. I mean, it is an ongoing process, and so I mean, I think in that sense, there was one person yesterday who said that there would be community engagement throughout the life of the project, like 25 years or whatever. And so no, I wouldn't say that it's substantially completed.
Thank you for. I apologize. Please finish.
And then the other would be I think at this point, I mean, someone had mentioned mediation as well. I think it was an off the cuff remark. I mean, I think something should be done, and I think part of the problem is that the 2 sides at this point are fairly well entrenched to the point where they probably don't really trust each other very much. That's speculation, but then so my sense is that yes, having some third entity work through this would actually be quite useful. Now, because it's gone on so far, it might be that there's actually multiple third entities in the sense that it could be that you need mediation now. But that if the project does go through, then having something long-term where you have someone maintaining a website about what's going on, right? What are the reports? How do you find environmental impact statements or whatever would be useful. But in that sense, because it's gotten to a conflict, I think that there are really 2 different things to be solved now.
Thank you.
Okay.
So just to clarify, what I had intended to say was that the community outreach, not that it was almost completed, but a substantial amount has been performed to date. Not that it was almost completed. Let's look at page 2 of your report number 1, and go ahead and take a moment to find the paragraph that starts with several general elements of community engagement plan are significant for evaluating.
Wait, I'm sorry, which document is this?
I'm sorry, this is page 2 of your special report, which is referred to as report number 1.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, under number 2.
The report that you authored. So just quickly, you identify several general elements of community engagement plan, which may be summarized, which I will go ahead and summarize. You can look at it and track it and ensure it's accurate. But basically, identify stakeholders, provide appropriate information, allow for feedback, respond to feedback, and create ongoing interaction. I know you have your particular views and opinions. Those are very basic elements. I think you would have to agree that's been done here in this case. And you can go through each one of them. I'd like to have you confirm that. Certainly, stakeholders have been identified, information has been provided. There's been feedback and responses, feedback and ongoing interaction. So I think those basic criteria have been met.
Well, actually, I guess I would object because those aren't criteria. Those are categories in which you would put criteria. So then the question becomes, what does it mean to respond to feedback? So there are evaluations for each of these, right? So yeah, is appropriate information provided? Well, what do you mean by appropriate? And so in that sense, no, I would object. I wouldn't think that these have been met because they're not criteria. They're categories of evaluation.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
Thank you for the clarification.
Okay.
With regard to the characterization of so-called Innergex's quote-unquote attitude that was mentioned by counsel for Miko a moment ago, this is sentence on page 9 that starts, Innergex's basic message is, which we just talked about a moment ago.
Right, okay, the quote.
So is that something that you crafted, or is that actual excerpt from public comment?
No, it's an excerpt from
Okay.
a public comment.
And with regard to the statement, it includes the statement, we will use Maui Meadows roads to access the site. Do you see that statement? Did you know, is it your understanding that Maui Meadows roads actually will not be used to access the site?
No, and I really didn't focus on the statements of fact in that quote. It was more the tone and, and some of the reflections on the process.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then on page 10 of your report, you reference, or you state that a community engagement process should be iterative. And I just would like to briefly explore that with you. We have on the record an indication of over 100 separate events, including multiple meetings with different stakeholders. And I think by any definition of the word iterative, if that would qualify, wouldn't you agree?
No, partly because my understanding of iterative is that it actually changes from one position to the next. So an iterative program, there's stage one, and then the next iteration is a different stage. And and this was one of the things. One of my concerns with the report from 2018 was that there was a list, a long list of people that were met with, but there was no indication of what happened as a result. And so, in a sense, there's no iteration, or the fact that there's 100 different events doesn't mean that it's iteration, because it could be a repetition of the first one. And so, like, one thing I would have looked for, and it might be there, and I'm sorry if it is, and I've missed it, but I would look for how the PowerPoint changed over time, right? And so if I go back to, June 2018, is it different now, or was it different in June 2019? And because that would be an indication of some kind of iterative process. So yeah, no, I wouldn't, because it's ongoing, that doesn't mean it's iterative.
Thank you.
Okay.
And with regard to community outreach processes, you would agree that there will be, or there may be, or perhaps will be other opportunities for public participation in permitting and approval processes for necessary governmental permits.
As I understand it, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then with regard to just to clarify your position with regard to relocation of the project that was discussed a moment ago, Council for Miko, your position is that as long as the project is not relocated, the community outreach is ineffective. Is that essentially your point?
No, not at all. No, because my scope here is to really reflect on the quality of the process. And so whether any particular change happens or not, in and of itself is not relevant to the quality of the process, because it might be that there are no other places to go. And one of the no other places to relocate the project. And if that's the case, then not relocating is an appropriate result. But the problem, but when I reflect on the process, the problem is that it's not really clear who is looking where and why. And so, because again, that sort of happened in relative secrecy from the public, and there are a lot of reports that that aren't available and so on. That's the problem. That it's not whether it's the result isn't necessarily the issue. It's the quality of the process that matters, from my perspective right now.
Thank you, Professor Richardson. No further questions, Chair.
Thank you. Commission Council,
No questions.
Commissioner Sunstein,
No questions.
Commissioner
No
Potter.
questions.
No questions from me either.
Right.
Excuse. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Could we please have Caroline Barros? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please go ahead.
There's something wrong with the live stream.
Just that. Trying to reconnect. I'll just
Recess.
end it and start it again.